Kia ora. Thank you for your warm welcome, David. It's a pleasure to be here. I realise it's a cold evening. I hope you're warm enough. We might be able to warm everyone up through what I'm going to say. And it's great to see some old friends, and it really is old friends now, given our age and stage. Before I begin my remarks this evening, a few sort of preliminary matters. The first is that in our midst is the former minister here, Sylvia Purdue, and I've got a copy of her wonderful book, Women in Creation Care, and Sylvia has bought some copies for sale after this talk, so please connect with Sylvia to get some copies.
Can I ask Sylvia to stand and make herself?
Yes.
There you are. Yep.
And while we're sort of doing a bit of advertising, I continue to edit a journal called Policy Quarterly, which is published by the Institute for Governance and Policy Studies, and it's free, it's online, you just Google Policy Quarterly. It covers a multiplicity of contemporary issues, mostly New Zealand focused, but some international issues, and I just commend it to you, particularly if you're interested in the sorts of topics we're going to be talking about this evening. So let me quickly indicate what I plan to discuss. So I want to really think about the challenge of governing for the long run in a context where our political systems, democratic or otherwise, are very much focused on the near term, 3 to 5 years. And with 3-year electoral cycles in a country like New Zealand, there's a very strong political incentive to think about kind of 2 to 3 years rather than 20 to 30 years, let alone hundreds of years. And then I want to talk a little bit about some of the really big policy challenges we face globally and locally, in particular ecological problems, and talk briefly about our responsibilities to future generations, or for future generations, and indeed the amazing creation we have the privilege to share. Why governing for the future is hard, how we might frame a sort of vision, values and virtues for governing for the future, and then briefly some ways in which we can protect long-term interests or future-focused interests in some of the things we need to do at a policy level and then within the Christian community. And my remarks tonight, are very much coming from an academic who's a Christian, and where I have sought through my academic career to allow my Christian values and principles and theology to influence the nature of the work that I do. So if I could just very briefly summarise, and I hope people can see this further back, it might be a little bit hard to see, but if I just summarise really the key points I want to make, and then I'll go through. And because this lecture is being recorded, it might be easier if I just speak for 30 or 40 minutes and then have questions and discussion, because the problem is the recording won't pick up necessarily the questions. So here we go. Key messages. There are powerful political pressures for governments and parliaments, and indeed local councils and regional councils, to focus on immediate or short-term problems, and so we have in effect the tyranny of the present. Protecting creation and the rights of interest and well-being of future generations is absolutely vital morally. It's not some sort of optional extra. We have an absolute moral obligation to do so. Unfortunately, we're not doing that very well, and currently humanity faces unprecedented governance challenges, and a failure to address them globally and locally will undermine intergenerational well-being. It will cause grave injustice, additional injustice of what we have already. It will increase fiscal risks and impose huge, if not unmanageable costs on future generations. Indeed, the costs that future generations are likely to face are mind-boggling and deeply, deeply concerning. If we're going to make any progress to reducing those costs, we need major and comprehensive policy reforms to drive a profound and radical reshaping of the global economy in the interests of a zero carbon economy and essentially a circular economy rather than a linear economy. And we're not making nearly enough progress in those directions. And perhaps I could just begin with a question in this regard. How many of you, from time to time, and I know in COVID times it's been probably a little less, but how many of you from time to time fly in an aircraft? Just about everyone. And can I just ask you, when you do fly, do you always buy carbon credits? Those who do? Just a few. Yes. When I asked my students at Victoria University that question, in a class, I mean it's very different now under COVID, but if you had a class of 300, you might get 3 hands go up, 1%. And I say to my students, well, that's wonderful for the 3 of you, but I can't buy carbon credits on behalf of the rest of you. Actually, a lot of the students don't know what carbon credits are. I won't embarrass you by asking, but if you don't, you can Google it when you get home. All right, so away we go. A few quotes to start with. The United Nations Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, last week made the following remarks. He said, half of humanity is in the danger zone from floods, droughts, extreme storms, and wildfires. No nation is immune, yet we continue to feed our fossil fuel addiction. We have a choice, collective action or collective suicide. It's in our hands. And currently we are on the path of collective suicide. And in terms of floods, well, it's wonderful to come to Christchurch and see them. Of course, if you live in Wellington, you can see them there too, and there's lots of other challenges. Catherine Booth, who some of you may be familiar with, is the co-founder of the Salvation Army, very quotable person. One of her better quotes is, to better the future, we must disturb the present. To better the future, we must disturb the present. And, well, she and her husband certainly did in wonderful ways. And I guess my challenge to you tonight would be, are you willing to disturb the present in the interests of protecting the future? A few more quotes now, turning to the challenge of short-termism. The first one here is from a Harvard professor, Dennis Thompson, who's written books on the subject. He says, democracies are systematically biased in favour of the present. In giving greater weight to the present, they neglect the future. Warren Buffett, financier, some of you may invest with him. When human politicians choose between the next election and the next generation, he says, it's clear what usually happens. In other words, the next election wins over the interests of the next generation. And Al Gore, the former US Vice President, who just in the last week said he thinks civilization is now seriously at risk, and I think he's right. He said, the future whispers while the present shouts. I think it's a wonderful quote, very memorable. The future whispers while the present shouts. And he has experienced that, of course, firsthand as a senior politician in a major democracy. The former president of the Royal Society of the United Kingdom, a very distinguished astronomer, Lord Martin Rees, said the following, and I think it's very poignant in many ways. He said, we know that we are stewards of a precious pale blue dot in a vast cosmos with a future measured in billions of years. But despite these vastly expanded conceptual horizons, politics and economics are short-term and parochial. And it's hard not to agree with him. And then if we think about how we might break the tragedy of short-termism, or what some people have called the tragedy of the short-term horizon, here's an ancient Greek proverb. A society grows great when old men and women, and forgive me, but there's plenty of such people in this group tonight, plant trees whose shade they know they shall never sit in. And of course I'm old as well, so we all have a kind of responsibility there. This Greek proverb highlights it. And then the great law of the Iroquois Confederacy includes these words, in our every deliberation, we must consider the impact of our decisions on the next 7 generations. Well, that's 175 years, isn't it? If you have a 25-year generation, if we're into 30-year generations now, it takes us to 210 years. I just wonder, for those of you who are involved in decision-making at local government, in other spheres of life and business, do you think about the next 7 generations? Or just the next 7 days or 7 years? I wonder. All right. Turning now to some of the problems, and many of you in this audience are very familiar with the range of global and local problems we face, and there's no shortage of them. Just very briefly, at the ecological level, we face a world in which we are exceeding safe planetary boundaries or biophysical limits in a variety of ways with our greenhouse gas emissions, with biodiversity loss, and various types of pollution, acidification of the oceans occurring as a result of the absorption of carbon dioxide into the ocean. So in effect, we're turning our oceans into fizz, and we will destroy much marine life. We'll be moving from sort of fish burgers to slime burgers in the future because there won't be any fish. Huge problems, and I'll come back to some of those shortly. The issues of fiscal management. As a result of COVID, most democracies now have public debts of around 100% of GDP. Japan's public debt is, I think, well over 250% of GDP. So some huge debt problems, and as interest rates go up internationally, that's going to impose even greater burdens on paying the interest on those debts. We have a rapidly changing demographic, a changing demographic in many countries, with population aging, fewer births, and major changes occurring sort of across the world. Relatively young South Asian population and African population. So while we've got about 8 billion people on the planet right now, or almost 8 billion, we're expected to get close to 10 billion within the next 30 to 40 years. But there will be a huge shift in the distribution, with Africa growing immensely, parts of South Asia growing, but parts of Europe and possibly New Zealand and Australia contracting, depending on migration flows and so on. We've got obviously huge issues in the area of the spread of infectious diseases, and just to add to that, I took part in a webinar a year or so ago with the former Chief Medical Officer of Health for England, who retired from her position there just before COVID struck, and took up a position at Cambridge as the head of Trinity College, Cambridge. Her expertise is in antimicrobial resistance, and she said in this webinar, if we think we've got a problem with COVID, just wait for antimicrobial resistance to take off. It will be far, far worse. So huge challenges in the health area. We've got challenges in terms of managing our complex socio-cultural diversity. We've got this fourth industrial revolution underway with artificial intelligence and robotics and so on, which will have profound implications, some of which we can barely imagine at the moment. We've got something in the vicinity of 70 million people who are displaced in one way or another. So already, well before climate change really begins to impact in big ways, mass migration, which is very disruptive for societies. Just watch what's happening in the United Kingdom at the moment as the two candidates for the Prime Ministership compete with each other to tell the population how many people they will shift out to Rwanda or whoever will take them if the British government's prepared to pay, etc., etc. We've got obviously issues in relation to infrastructure, big issues here in New Zealand. The bill is estimated to kind of deal with some of the infrastructure problems we've got in this country. It runs to 200 billion, that's around about 2/3 of our gross domestic product and about twice of what the government spends every year. So huge problems, and that's without thinking about huge amounts of sea level rise over the coming century and beyond, and of course major natural disasters. One of the types of problems that we really do need to think about really seriously are what are called creeping problems or slow threats. These are problems that kind of grow gradually, typically out of sight, out of mind. The scientific community may know about them, though they may disagree on the seriousness of the problems. They have very little public visibility, so there's very little media coverage, and there's often quite a lot of uncertainty around them. And then the problem with these creeping problems is that if they're not dealt with early enough, they literally creep up on you and maybe pass certain critical thresholds, and then you have really, really serious problems on your hand. And I've just listed a few of the many, many creeping problems that we are faced with now. Antimicrobial resistance is there, increasing surveillance of individuals and groups, and a kind of loss of privacy, and threats to liberty, the threat to social trust, political trust, and evidence-informed policy making from fact-diverse political movements, post-truth narratives, and fake news. And people like Donald Trump have done immense damage, just absolutely immense damage, as does Fox News, to the capacity of a society to have a serious, evidence-informed conversation about big issues. Increasing inequality of income and wealth, globally and locally, is a kind of creeping problem with immense implications. The spreading obesity pandemic internationally, and so on and so on. So there's a variety of different types of these problems, and they're the kind of problem which, unfortunately, our political systems tend not to give very much attention to, because they're not in the public eye, and so politicians aren't having the public constantly urging them to do things to address these problems. The scientific community may be saying things, but the scientific community often is ignored. All right, so let me just say a few words about one of the really big issues we face, and about which some I know in this audience are expert. This will just be some brief comments. Climate change imposes just enormous risks, globally and locally, from sea level rise, from more intense storms, from more severe droughts and heat waves that we've been witnessing across the world in the last few weeks, and so on. Risks to life, risks to food production, which will then impose risks to life, risks to disruption of business. If we think we've got supply chain problems with COVID, just wait a little bit longer to see the supply chain issues that climate change will generate as sea level rise disrupts port facilities, airports, and so on all over the world. Franz Josef Glacier. I first visited that in 1970 as a 13-year-old, and went back with my daughter Grace and my wife Mary about 6 or 7 years ago. The change was dramatic. In 1970, you could literally drive to the face of the Franz Josef Glacier, get out of the car, and it was just 50 metres away. Well, now you can't even walk to it. And this, of course, is partly at least the product of climate change. We've been witnessing these extreme events around the world with increasing frequency in recent years. And this diagram, I hope, will help explain why that is. What this basically says is that you only need a very small shift in mean temperatures, or average temperatures, mean temperatures in a region, to have a much more significant shift in the number of extreme events that you're going to have. So the yellow there, if you can see the two situations, in the early phase, you've got only a few hot days in the yellow. You shift the temperature just 1 or 2 degrees, and land surface temperatures around the world are up about 2 degrees, even though, if you include the oceans, it's about 1.1. Shift 1 or 2 degrees, and you get vastly more hot weather, and then you get even hotter weather. The really extreme events that were virtually impossible previously. And that's exactly what's happening. Same with precipitation events. The atmosphere is able to hold more water when it's warmer, and you get more intense precipitation events or longer precipitation events. So, oops, lazy, yeah, keep going, here we go. So, sea level rise, I'll just speak briefly about that because that's one of the really big consequences of climate change. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and I appreciate there are people here who know a lot about this, but it produced its 6th assessment report in 3 volumes over the last year or so. It projects a rise of between about 1/3 of a metre and just over a metre in the global mean sea level by 2100, depending on the path of greenhouse gas emissions. So depending on whether we actually do stay within 1.5 degrees of warming, which is highly unlikely, or whether we end up with something like 3 or 4 degrees by the end of the century above pre-industrial levels. That's their kind of range, but then they say larger increases cannot be ruled out under a high greenhouse gas emissions scenario, and they say that, you know, we could have, if we fail to really reduce emissions rapidly over the coming decades, we could have up to 2 metres of sea level rise by 2100. That's only 78 years away, and I'm sure there are people in this audience who are at least 78, so you just think that would be within your lifetime if you were born in the last few years. 5 metres by 2150, so that's 138 years, and, oh, is that right? Yeah, 128 years, and 15 metres by 2300 to 2300, so that's 178 years, isn't it? Now that's at the extreme, but nonetheless, it cannot be ruled out. And I'll show you some pictures shortly about the consequences of that. And at the moment, sea level is rising globally at an average rate of about 3 to 4 centimetres a decade, but it's rising, and it will accelerate almost certainly significantly over coming decades. And of course, sea level rise won't just stop in 2100 or in 2200 or 2300. It will continue for potentially millennia, depending on whether we can stabilise greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, if not reduce concentrations of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So we need to assume, to be prudent, that we'll probably have, or we could well have, up to 1 metre by 2100, and possibly a lot more. And even 1 metre of sea level rise will do enormous damage around the world. Bearing in mind that's the sort of average, and there are going to be huge variations across the planet because of the impact of ocean currents, vertical land movements up and down. Kaikoura has been very lucky. It got a vertical uplift of 1 to 1.5 metres, which gives it potentially another 50 to 100 years. Whereas parts of Christchurch and the earthquakes went down a metre, which in effect, brought sea level rise forward by half a century or so. So different parts of the world are going to move in different ways and be impacted differently. If you just think about the increased frequency of 1 in 100 year events from coastal flooding. I don't know if you can see this further back, but it's comparing Auckland and Wellington, and it's basically saying, suppose you had a 30 centimetre rise in sea level, which is possible within the next 3 to 4 decades, then in Auckland, a 1 in 100 year event would occur every 4 years, and in Wellington it would happen every year. And I looked up Lyttelton to see what your spring tide range is. It's around 2.3 metres, so it's probably somewhere between the Wellington and Auckland numbers. It may be, say, once every 2 years. So you can just imagine sort of what that's going to do. If I can get this going out to go. This is happening, of course, now. This is Tamaki Drive in Auckland, a major thoroughfare to the eastern suburbs, regularly getting flooded. We've had, enormous floods here in New Zealand over the last few years in various parts. I should update this because Westport you could put 2022 as well, and of course many other places in 2022, Gisborne, Christchurch, and so on. Now here's Christchurch with 10 metres of sea level rise, which is perfectly possible if we stabilise at around 2 degrees of warming for long enough, a few centuries. And, well, I'm afraid there's not a great deal of Christchurch left. If you were lucky enough to live in Wollaston, you'd be all right. If you lived in Burnside, you'd be all right. But frankly, if you lived anywhere near the centre of the city or eastern part of the city or anywhere near the rivers, you'd be awash. And if we went to 25 metres of sea level rise, well, Captain Cook would have been right in thinking that it was Banks Island, not Banks Peninsula. And sorry to say, pretty well the whole city's gone. If you were sensible enough to build at Wollaston, you'd be okay, at least until the sea went up further. So this is just one city in a world in which there are thousands and thousands of coastal cities, and in the vicinity of 1 billion or 2 living either near the coast or at the coast. This is Wellington with just 1 metre of sea level rise. It basically wipes out much of the central business district. $60 billion worth of property, and that could happen within the lifetime of people alive today. This, unfortunately, is the prospect of many young people. Now, take another city, Dunedin. Those of you who are familiar with Dunedin, just a few quick points here. There are in South Dunedin and in a few other parts of Dunedin around 2,700 homes and over 100 businesses that are within 50 centimetres of the current spring high tide mark. 50 centimetres. And so basically South Dunedin will be gone one way or another this century. 10,000 people, I think a dozen schools, 300 businesses. Where are they going to go? And if we think that's a problem, think about the wider problem. Here's Vietnam, Mekong Delta. When projections were done about sea level rise some years ago, it was thought that the delta was going to be quite badly impacted, but the analysis was redone about 3 years ago, and using somewhat different techniques, about which there may be people in the audience that know a lot more about than I, but basically it means that most of the Mekong Delta will be underwater. This is one of the breadbaskets of Southeast Asia. Millions, tens of millions of people are fed from this area, and Ho Chi Minh City, 40% of that is below 1 metre. Below 1 metre. And it's not just Ho Chi Minh City. Bangkok. Bangkok basically has no future in the current global context. And multiple other cities. Mumbai, 30 million people. Shanghai, 30 million people. Enormously vulnerable to sea level rise. Tokyo, 30 million people. And so on. So, this is not science fiction. I wish it was. It's what is in store, which is enormously challenging and worrying. Some of you will be familiar with this, but this basically just shows you the sort of global land and ocean surface temperature rise over the last 140 years or so, from 1880. Key point here is not just that the temperatures are rising, but it distinguishes the ocean temperatures from the land temperatures. And you can see that the ocean temperature is rising at about half the rate, or even less than half the rate, than land surface temperatures. And that helps explain why, even with just 1 degree Celsius or 1.1 degrees Celsius of warming globally on average, which includes the oceans, actually you're getting much bigger increases in various parts of the world on land, and indeed in the northern part of the northern hemisphere, increases of 4 or 5 degrees, and so on. And then finally, just on this, what is the challenge for us as a human species in this context? Scientists have calculated that if we were to have a reasonable chance, say a 50% chance of avoiding more than 1.5 degrees of warming, and we've already warmed about 1.1 degrees, so we're well on track for 1.5 within the next 20 years or so. How much carbon dioxide can we burn? And the answer is around 740 gigatons of carbon. So that's the carbon number rather than carbon dioxide number. You have to multiply to get carbon dioxide. But let's say 740 gigatons of carbon, and it's estimated that by the end of last year we had kind of emitted around 610 gigatons of carbon since the Industrial Revolution, giving us a remaining budget globally and in effect forever, unless we can suck carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, of 120 gigatons. we're currently globally emitting around 10 gigatons of carbon per annum. So that gives us 12 years at current rates. And although there was a little bit of a dip in carbon dioxide emissions as a result of the first year of the COVID pandemic, the emissions bounced back last year and are on track not to change very much over the next few years. And governments all over the world are struggling to kind of make changes of the kind that would be needed to actually bring emissions down quickly. And of course, with the war in Europe, we have the added problem that many countries in Western Europe are now looking to keep their coal-powered power stations going, burning more coal, and coal is one of the worst contributors to carbon dioxide emissions globally. So, really big problems. If you thought about this from a New Zealand perspective, I mean, most of us have well and truly used up our carbon budget forever. If you're thinking about going for a trip overseas, just bear in mind, you've already blown your budget. Think about it in terms of, your bank balance. You've got no money left, all right? You're actually in debt. And you're now thinking of buying another house or buying another car. Well, who's going to be paying you for that to enable you to do it? Sadly, I mean, these sorts of numbers are just hardly ever talked about in public, whether here in New Zealand or internationally, for rather obvious reasons, because governments don't want really people to really focus on this, because it's extremely worrying. I had the opportunity a few years ago, it's now probably 13, 14 years ago, to ask at a conference our former Prime Minister, Helen Clark, and the then Australian Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, whether they agreed with the view of the then Chancellor of Germany that we should allocate the remaining carbon budget of the planet equally across the global population, as a sort of fair way of allocating what remains of the atmospheric space we have available forever. And Helen Clark said, I was absolutely stunned, she didn't think the principle of equality was a very good principle. I thought, here's a social democrat leading advocate of equality. She doesn't think equality is a very good principle for allocation. And I'm sure by that she didn't mean that New Zealanders should have less than everyone else. She probably thought it would be better if we had more than anyone else, I suspect. And Kevin Rudd gave an extremely long, erudite answer that I simply didn't understand. And I didn't have the audacity of Kim Hill to question him on his logic. Some of you may have heard the interview he did with Kim Hill recently. All right, so moving right along and very quickly. As Christians, for those of you who are in this audience, we have a very strong theological basis for caring about the wonderful creation God has endowed us with and protecting the rights, interests and well-being of future generations. And they rest on fundamental doctrines of the Christian faith. The doctrine of creation, this is God's world, God loves it, we should love it. The recognition of disorder, that we need to take seriously, that there is human weakness and sin and evil and badness, and that we need to recognize that and address it. The doctrine of the incarnation, God becoming flesh, taking on creatureliness, taking on earth, if you like, which tells us something about the value of creatureliness to God, and the doctrines of redemption and renewal, which speak of God's redeeming work, not just for human beings, but for the whole created order. The important moral principle of neighbour love, which we need to think about not just in terms of who's living next door to us or who's living up the road, but who's going to be living in the future, that we have an obligation to enable to live an abundant life. Principle of justice, a concern for the poor and those who are going to be least able to defend themselves in a world with rising tides, increasing floods, increasing disruption to food supplies, and so on. I mean, right now we're faced with a context in which millions and millions of people are going to be going hungry because of a war in Eastern Europe and price rises generated by that war. And of course we have enormous obligation to be simply wise stewards of all the resources that we have available to us in what Pope Francis calls our common home. So there are various principles of intergenerational fairness, and since time is short, I won't go into those now, but happy to come back to them. The one that you may be very familiar with is the third one, 3.1, which is this idea enunciated by the World Commission on Environment and Development, which says that pursuing sustainable development means meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. It's a kind of principle of intergenerational sufficiency. We do need to meet people's needs, but we mustn't compromise the capacity of those living in the future to meet their needs. And unfortunately, we are in many ways doing that today. There are various ways of trying to measure intergenerational fairness, and again, I'm happy to come back to this in questions if you like. Why are we having difficulty protecting the interests of future generations? Why? Well, multiple reasons, and here's some of them. First of all, there are competing ethical frameworks and principles. There are difficult trade-offs, and that is one problem. Another blindingly obvious problem is simply the human condition. Self-interest, myopia, weak will, cognitive biases, it won't happen to me, it won't happen to people in the future, false optimism bias, and so on. People's unwillingness to confront reality. I was having a meeting with someone who was responsible for the red zone on the Cashmere Hills here, post-earthquake, responsible for some 660 buyouts of properties because properties were at risk. I don't know if any of you were in that category, but he told me of one situation where there was somebody living in their house. They had a boulder go right through the house, and they wanted to stay because they thought they were safe. It won't happen to me, even though a boulder had already gone through the house. This myopia, this unwillingness to face hard, cold facts. Uncertainty is an issue. We can be much more certain about what's likely to happen in the near future than in the far future. So some of you may be thinking what I'm talking about 50 years out or 100 years out, it won't happen, or it's too uncertain to be worried about. Well, not sure about that. Collective action problems. Many of the issues we face are global, they need collective action, but getting people to agree can be very difficult, and not least because of geopolitical tensions, which are now, unfortunately, rising, making collective global action all the more difficult. There are very strong, powerful politically salient asymmetries. What do I mean by that? In many cases, in order to protect the long run, you have to invest upfront to generate benefits in the future or to reduce risks and costs in the future. But politically, it's much harder to persuade people to bear costs now, even though there are going to be benefits in the long run. Not least because the costs are visible, they're current, they're urgent, they're now, they're right before you. The benefits are sort of maybe 10 years, 20 years, or 100 years away. They're not visible. They're less salient to people, and people aren't willing to make the trade. Another problem is simply powerful vested interests, like the fossil fuel industry, like the dairy industry in New Zealand, ranged against dispersed, weak community groups, environmental groups, and so on. And, in most cases where you have powerful, concentrated interests ranged against dispersed and diffuse interests, the powerful interests win. So, many other issues as well. Time is short, I'll just press on. What's the way forward? Well, it seems to me we need a collective vision, globally and nationally and locally. As Proverbs says, where there is no vision, the people perish. So we need an inspiring, meaningful vision. In my view, it needs to be a vision of an inclusive, just, peaceful, and ecologically sustainable nation and world, which is infused with certain values, both procedural and substantive values, about a shared commitment, amongst other things, to the truth, to honesty, to justice and ecological integrity. And it seems to me it's incumbent upon the Christian community to be advocates of that kind of thing, and inspired by the virtues that we witness through the gospel accounts and the letters of Paul, the fruit of the Spirit, the idea of personal integrity, walking the talk, and so on. So we need to talk about vision, values, and virtues, and do that vigorously and rigorously, and walk the talk. How can we, from a political point of view, national point of view, protect future interests? Again, I'm happy to come back to this in questions, but there are a number of ways of framing this. One of them is the use of commitment devices. A marriage contract, New Year's resolutions are commitment devices. You're basically saying, I'm committed to this. And by committing to this publicly, it makes it more difficult, not impossible, but more difficult to back out, because you will suffer reputational damage. There will be costs to bear. So one of the ways we can try and protect future interests is to ensure that governments make certain types of commitments, have commitment devices. So we say, right, we're going to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by X by a certain date. Or we say we're going to reduce poverty, child poverty, by X amount by a certain date. And if we don't, well, governments can be held accountable. Or we say we're going to have legislation which requires governments to be fiscally responsible, with clear principles of fiscal responsibility. Or that governments have to be sustainable, with clear principles of sustainability, and so on. Secondly, we need better foresight. I was speaking to a group of parliamentarians last week in Wellington from around the Pacific, about 40 MPs who are members of what are called public accounts committees, or the equivalents. We have a finance and expenditure committee. And I asked them how many of them had undertaken any kind of foresight activity as part of their committee work in recent years. And of the dozens of committees represented around the Pacific Islands, the states of Australia, the Commonwealth of Australia, and New Zealand Parliament, only 2 had done any kind of foresight work, any kind of looking ahead, scenario analysis, trend analysis, and so on. We need to be anticipating what's coming, so that we can prepare and we can be proactive in addressing that. Institutional voices for the future. Well, in New Zealand we have a parliamentary commissioner for the environment. In effect, a voice for the future, an institutionalised voice of the future. We have a commissioner for children. Children are our future, so another institutional voice for the future. Wales has a commissioner for future generations. Maybe we should have that kind of thing. The Finnish Parliament has a committee for the future. It's one of its dedicated standing committees. I've tried to get the New Zealand Parliament to consider that, but there's been no interest to date. They obviously don't want any future. And then there's other things that we can do, including trying to nurture a political culture that has shared values and a level of trust that enables politicians to do deals and strike bargains to protect long-term interests, because most long-term interests are going to require governments, successive governments, keeping to a clear policy strategy to address that problem. And if you can't get agreement across the political spectrum for that, then you're not going to succeed. You're going to have chopping and changing all the time and getting nowhere. In New Zealand, we've failed to bring agriculture into the emissions trading scheme so far. In 2008, I stood on the steps of Parliament the day that the legislation introducing our emissions trading scheme was enacted. It must have been about August 2008. I stood next to the then head of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, now Sir Martin Weavers, and he said, Jonathan, isn't this great? We've got an all gases, all sectors emissions trading scheme. And I said to Martin, well, we haven't quite, and I'm not confident we will. Well, 14 years later, agriculture still is not part of it. Maybe it will be in 2 years' time if the current government is re-elected, but that can't be taken for granted. All right, so what do? We need a whole raft of policy changes, and again, happy to come back to this. Globally, we just have to get on with the business of radical decarbonisation of our energy and transport systems and massive changes in the way we use resources to minimise waste and so on. New Zealand happens to have one of the highest rates of waste of any society in the world. It is really dreadful, and it's only in recent years that governments have really begun to do anything about that. We also have a terrible record in relation to biodiversity loss of species. Absolutely terrible record, and we need to do something about that. Okay, finally, a few words about the Christian community and some perhaps hard words from the former Archbishop of Canterbury to conclude. What is the role of the Christian community in all this? Well, there are multiple things that I think we can and should be doing. First of all, we should seek to become fully informed about the urgency and gravity of the big issues we face, not least the ecological issues. Secondly, we need to apply key Christian doctrines and ethical imperatives and take them seriously and live faithfully in the light of them. And that means many things, including, and I've put up there, practicing lament and praying for the transformative and reconciling work of the Spirit of God. There is much to lament. We are losing every day precious parts of God's good creation, and we are on an escalator to do huge damage to this wonderful planet. There is much to lament. We need an ecological reformation. We need to rethink humanity's relationship with nature. Just think a moment, we currently have a government committed to a well-being framework, human well-being. Where does the environment fit into that? Well, you could say, oh, well, the environment fits in the case of protecting future human well-being. But do we protect the environment merely because we want future humans to be able to enjoy the environment? Is that the only reason? Doesn't the environment have intrinsic value in and of itself? Even if there weren't any human beings, wouldn't it be valuable? It would be valuable to God. Okay, I should finish. We need to be alert to the denial of truth and the forces of disorder and so on, and they are very powerful at the moment. And we need to speak of hope, but be honest about what we can now reasonably hope for. I have lots of students, who are desperately concerned about their future. They are informed about the ecological crisis and other challenges we face. And they often ask me, well, Professor Boston or Jonathan, however they call me, what can we hope for? And I think as Christians we have to be absolutely honest. We can't deny what robust scientific evidence tells us is coming at us from the future. And here's, you won't be able to see this, but I can read it out, the words of Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, some years ago, in fact 10 years ago. He said the following. He said, to suggest that God might intervene to protect us from the corporate folly of our practices is as unchristian and unbiblical as to suggest that God protects us from the results of individual folly and sin. If I walk out on the road in front of an oncoming car, it may well hit me. This is not a creation in which there are no real risks. Our Christian faith has always held that the inexhaustible love of God cannot compel justice or virtue. We are capable of doing immeasurable damage to ourselves as individuals, and it seems clear that we have the same terrible freedom as a human race. Does that mean that all is lost? Well, I believe not. In Christ, it seems to me, there are grounds for hope, not for defeatism or fatalism. Behold, Jesus said, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. And Rowan Williams writes again, God's faithfulness stands, assuring us that even in the most appalling disaster, love will not let go. Even in the most appalling disaster, be it Auschwitz or be it what's coming in terms of the damage of climate change, love will not let go. I hope that's a sort of evocative picture of people holding on to each other in the midst of disaster and not letting go. Love does not let go, and God's love does not let go. So we face unprecedented policy challenges. They are unprecedented. We need to recognise that. These are not just ordinary, normal things that we have dealt with previously. There are strong incentives for governments to focus on the short run and not address these long-term issues. Listen to how often some of the politicians in this country talk about the big long-term issues. You will hear silence from some of them. Safeguarding long-term interests is hard and requires a multi-pronged approach. There's no simple silver bullet. There are important reforms that we need to be making, and in my view, the Christian community has a vital role to play in speaking truth to power and living faithfully so that when we do speak, we are walking the talk and can speak with integrity. Thank you. And I'm sorry I've gone a bit long.